Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Assembly's first Higher Ed Live event. We have got a great panel and a ton to talk about. I'm Emily Stephenson. I'm the Deputy Managing Editor at the Assembly, and I oversee our higher education coverage, and I edit our newsletter, The Quad. A couple of housekeeping notes before we get going. If you are here, you probably are a premium subscriber to the Assembly and a reader of our higher ed newsletter, The Quad. Thank you for subscribing and supporting our journalism. We hope to do more events like this and potentially some other formats in the future. You might or might not be familiar with our other premium newsletter, The Docket, which covers courts and justice issues in North Carolina. Earlier today, we announced that The Docket will be expanding into a twice weekly premium only politics newsletter starting next week. Whether you work in policy, advocacy, law, or just want to understand how the government works, this newsletter is for you. If you are not already receiving the docket and you want to get our new premium politics newsletter, send us an email address at the address that we are about to share in the chat, and we'll add you right away. If you're a guest tuning into this webinar, I would encourage you to check out the Quad newsletter. We write about everything from how schools in Western North Carolina are recovering from Hurricane Helene to how UNC Chapel Hill plans to pay for its new football coach. You are going to find a lot that you're interested in. We'll put a link for the newsletter in the chat too. Lastly, we're in the middle of our March Madness sale. It's a limited time 50% off promotion on gift subscriptions. If you have a friend or family member with a birthday or another holiday coming up, a subscription for North Carolina News makes for a great gift. I have definitely given them. Great journalism is hard, time consuming, and expensive to produce. And so we really appreciate your help so that we can keep telling stories and breaking news about our state and its colleges and universities. And with that, let's get started. We are so glad to have you with us for this important conversation on the higher ed landscape in North Carolina. And we want to hear from you throughout this session. If you look at the bottom of the screen, you will see a Q&A button. And we'd like you to share your questions with our panelists. And we'll try to get to as many of those questions as we can over the next hour. And now I'm going to ask our panelists to join. And I'll introduce them while they are joining the webinar. We've got Sarah Brown, who is the news editor at the Chronicle of Higher Education, Colleen Murphy, who is managing editor of the local network at Open Campus, Erin Gretzinger, who is a higher ed reporter at the Assembly, and Matt Hartman, who is the other higher ed reporter at the Assembly. And now we're going to get started. We want to kick this off by talking about everything that's happened in the last few months, which is quite a lot. So let's start by talking about where things stand as far as federal policy toward higher education. Sarah, why don't you kick it off? Let's get a high-level overview of all of the federal policy changes that affect higher education institutions so far this year.
There's a lot to get through, so I'm going to do my best to get through as many things as possible. So first of all, probably something that is on everybody's minds here is the fact that the Trump administration and DOJ are trying their best to dismantle the education department. I'm going to get into that a little bit later in the program, but I just wanted to flag that's obviously something that's top of mind for folks who are working in and around the education space. It's been very disruptive. They've laid off, about half of the 4,000 employees in the department. So there's a lot of disruption there. Next thing I want to make sure we address is the attacks and elimination of DEI, so diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts. This was one of the first things that Trump did when he took office on January 20th. He signed a couple of executive orders basically saying that much of DEI is illegal race-based discrimination. That is the Trump administration's position. Did he define DEI? Not really. We've gotten a little bit of clarity since then via some guidance we've gotten from the education department. Basically, their stance is that, programming for Black History Month is not necessarily illegal DEI, but anything that is identity-based, so graduation ceremonies, support programs, potentially anything that it allegedly treats students differently based on their identity could be illegal under Trump's interpretation of civil rights law. And in any case, that vagueness is causing colleges across the country to censor themselves, erase DEI from their websites, preemptively comply with what they think the Trump administration is doing. That's something we're seeing all across the country. I'm going to hit two more things. One is research funding. So essentially, we have seen a couple of things I'll highlight. One is that the Trump administration tried pretty early on to drastically reduce the percent that colleges were receiving for indirect costs. And this is a super like jargony term that does probably mean something to some of the people in this room. But basically, colleges get a certain share when they get a grant to do research on cancer drugs, for example. They get a certain share of that grant to support administrative costs, costs of running the lab, staffing, keeping the lights on, et cetera. Trump wanted to slash that cost, that share to 15%. It would have instantly erased tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars from university budgets. Big deal. We've also seen some sort of that is tied up in court, just to be clear. So it's been, at this point, it's on hold, but is still sort of looming large in the higher education space. In addition, we've got some sort of direct targeting of specific institutions. So you all have probably heard about Columbia. We'll get into more of that later. But they have lost, they have had $400 million of their federal grants canceled. Most of them are from the National Institutes of Health for, again, for research having to do with, again, cancer drugs, malaria vaccines, that kind of thing. So the third thing I want to make sure I raise, targeting of international students and scholars. So Trump said on the campaign trail that he believes that, you know, these protests of the war in Gaza over the past year and a half are illegal, that they are anti-Semitic, and that he will go after, he's going to go after international students and scholars who participated in protests. He has signed an executive order doing so, and we have seen a massive uptick in ICE activity on college campuses where ICE agents are going to university dorms and knocking on the door and saying, like, we are taking you into custody, your student visa has been revoked, your green cards have been revoked. We are seeing that. It's got colleges all over the country on edge right now. And so those are the three things I'm going to hit and turn it back over to you, Emily.
Colleen, you're based in North Carolina, but you've got a view of colleges all across the country from what you do at Open Campus. Why don't you talk briefly about how Open Campus works and how that gives you into a window of how colleges across the country are responding to all the changes that have been happening?
Yeah, absolutely. So Open Campus is a nonprofit newsroom that partners with local newsrooms around the country to put reporters full-time on the higher ed beat. We have 17 newsroom partners right now and are in the process of adding more, with the goal of eventually having a full-time higher ed reporter in every state and every major metro around the country. And we really, the reason that we're set up this way is because we really believe that higher ed is fundamentally a local issue. Most Americans go to college within 50 miles of home, but most local newsrooms do not have dedicated higher ed coverage. So that is where we come in. The idea is that our local reporters know their communities and their colleges really deeply, and Open Campus knows higher ed really deeply. And so we're able to sort of supercharge their beat reporting. And this has been really powerful in a moment like this when we are seeing so much activity play out at the federal level. You know, like every day or at least every week, there's a new directive or piece of guidance from the Trump administration. And what is at stake is really at the local level. So the fact that we've got reporters around the country, you know, more than 20 of them in these partner newsrooms, means that we are able to really dig in and show what is happening, what's changing as a result of those directives that Sarah outlined. And, you know, kind of at a high level, I would say that we've seen a lot of examples of colleges and their presidents not really say much at all right now. There's a lot that's uncertain, and there is a lot that's held up in court. And we're pretty much across the board seeing that no one wants to be out front on this too much. The Cron just did a story earlier this week where they asked several dozen colleges what they would do in response to some demands from Trump. And most of them didn't reply at all. And those that did reply didn't really say anything. We've seen this happen in North Carolina too. So that research funding cut that Sarah mentioned that would mean hundreds of millions of dollars lost for the universities, particularly in North Carolina's Research Triangle. It would be pretty existential, not just to those institutions, but also to the economy. And yet, despite what's at stake there, granted, it is tied up in court, but despite what's at stake, the Peter Hans, who oversees the UNC system, put out a statement about this and really didn't say anything. He urged patience and said he was hopeful that there would be a healthy conversation about the benefits of university research. And that stood out to me as an editor who's working around the country with higher ed reporters right now for just how little it said. And you might be like, oh, North Carolina is a reddish, purplish state, depending on the day. Why would someone at a public institution say anything to poke the bear, so to speak? But we have seen examples, actually, of university presidents in red states speaking out very forcefully. It's not the norm. They're sort of the exception to the rule. But two, I want to just quickly highlight our Louisiana State University's president, William Tate, was very forceful in condemning the research cut. And he even talked about his grandfather's cancer diagnosis and what university research meant to his family, which was like notably sort of poignant and emotional, not usually a tone we hear from a college president. And then another example is Case Western Reserve University President Eric Kaler. Granted, this is a private university, but it's still in Ohio, a very red state that's taking a lot of swings against higher ed right now. He has spoken out against the research cut. He's also spoken out against the DEI guidance that came out from the administration, calling it a gross overreach, and sort of re-emphasizing that Case Western was going to stay committed to its core values, which includes like celebrating differences, which was pretty notable again, and that has not been the norm. We've seen a ton of examples of universities and their presidents shy away from commenting. And then we're also paying attention to this idea of preemptive compliance, which Sarah mentioned, which is, essentially getting in line in advance, whether it's because you are anticipating hearing from the Trump administration, you're trying to sort of get your ducks in a row, or you're trying to understand what they're saying. A lot of this guidance that they've put out is not all that clear. So when we've seen this time and time again, when universities are faced with uncertainty, they tend to act more conservatively in response. And so we're certainly seeing that. And I think a really prominent example of this sort of concession is Columbia University. I wouldn't call it preemptive compliance because they did get a pretty clear threat from the Trump administration to the tune of losing $400 million in federal funding if they didn't make some changes. But, Columbia is a very, very wealthy, highly selective private institution in a blue state, and we still saw them concede to everything that the Trump administration wanted. And I think we're going to look back on that moment in the months and years to come as a real marker of when things started to shift. We are not seeing examples yet of universities on their own forcefully fighting back. We have seen groups of them sue over some of the directives, but I think that was a significant moment for sure.
Erin, you've done a lot of reporting on the DEI requirement changes that we've just been talking about. You've done a lot of reporting on how that's playing out in North Carolina. Can you talk a little bit about that reporting?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, a lot of this is going to get at the questions like what Colleen was just bringing up with preemptive compliance or overcompliance. But just to provide some background of where North Carolina was prior to the Trump administration, because I think that's important in the context of the anti-DEI movement overall, is, sort of as you were seeing these major changes play out in Texas and Florida, North Carolina made its own change, specifically the UNC system, implemented the equality policy, and basically repealed its old DEI policy that had only been in effect a couple years and starting in 2019. But this new policy really focused on institutional neutrality, universities not commenting on political controversies of the day. And, universities were to comply with that policy and show what they changed in funding and positions, et cetera, by September, September 2024. And with that, we saw almost 60 positions eliminated in the system. Not clear if how people were laid off, how many people were laid off. 130 positions that were realigned, so new titles, descriptions, offices that were eliminated in some places with no direct replacement, others that were renamed, replaced. A couple universities said they had no offices at all. And overall, we were talking about, $16 million that were being redirected toward, student success and, well-being efforts. That was sort of the directive of the policy overall, to take DEI funding and redirect it toward those two things. So that sort of sets the groundwork. But even when that happened, I think something to note here is that the UNC system implemented that policy shortly after the legislature signaled, if you don't do something, we will. I talked to faculty who thought at that time, like, it was the right move for the system itself to make these changes with nuance and language and approach and clear carve-outs for things like curriculum and academic freedom, instead of waiting for the legislature to come in and implement their own vision for DEI. That said, I came to NC after working at the Chronicle of Higher Ed, where I'd been covering DEI extensively at Texas and Florida. Office positions and like realignments of those sorts were already drawing pretty hefty criticism from conservatives, who worried those changes were merely cosmetic. That skepticism was already sort of bubbling up in North Carolina, I think at the September Board of Governors meeting, where these audits of DEI came out. So all that sort of context leading up to where we are now in the past 8 weeks, I feel like that sort of second wave that we already saw in like Texas and Florida has come here now with that sort of heightened criticism and focus on DEI with that intensity that's been brought by the Trump administration. We've seen and heard about website changes. Some schools, most prominently NC State, have made change to like their mission statements, their strategic plans. And most crucially and controversially, the UNC system released a memo on February 5th that suspended all general education requirements and major specific requirements, mandating the completion of credits related to diversity, equity, inclusion. And that memo specifically cited some of the orders that Sarah brought up earlier, which, related to DEI, and that sort of being the justification for these curriculum-related changes. And again, circling back to Colleen's points about overcompliance, many people I've talked to see that, this is a drastic response that went beyond what the executive order required. I talked to some legal experts who said, the UNC system's memo on curriculum is one, if not, the most prominent examples of overcompliance in the national landscape to these executive orders because of that focus on curriculum specifically. So I think, and that's something the UNC General Counsel even sort of recognized in the memo in the first place. He'd said, even though further federal guidance is expected, litigation was expected, the system couldn't risk losing, I think it was like $1.4 billion that it receives in federal funding. So you're already seeing that tone and play out in North Carolina when they're thinking about preemptive compliance. And I think it is worth noting, we still have seen this pressure at the state level in the past. I think there's a lot of questions exactly who's the driving forces behind curriculum changes and other changes, because we know that has happened in the past. We did some reporting where, we've heard that multiple board members believed that the equality policy should have covered curriculum in the first place, always did cover curriculum. So it's also important to note while there's this tension at the federal level, that is playing out in the state level in a heightened way as well right now. And all this happened before the Dear Colleague letter, which called on colleges to end all race-conscious programs. That used the SFFA ruling on race-conscious admission sort of as the justification for that. And the UNC system has said last we heard that it believes it's in compliance, but I still think there's a lot of things to come in this arena as colleges are figuring out their response, looking at their programs. I think I didn't even get into private institutions as much, but I think they're in a fundamentally different position, and yet we've still seen the pressure at the federal level start to impact them. I think High Point universities is a great example. They had, a list of words that they were going to ban on campus. They quickly walked that back. But again, I think there's so many examples right now in North Carolina that just exemplify overall what kind of environment colleges are in and how they're thinking about that level of uncertainty and just how far to go, how high to jump, and all those sorts of things.
Since you mentioned websites, Erin, I just wanted to add something that we've been watching and I think has been really interesting here, which is that ACE, the American Council on Education, which is like the premier lobbying group for colleges and universities, has been very vocal since the beginning of the Trump administration about what is at stake here and the concerns that they have about the direction that the administration is trying to take higher ed. And one of the things that they keep saying is do not scrub your websites. If you are a university who was wiping your website after that Dear Colleague letter came out, you do not need to do that. The Dear Colleague letter, for one thing, doesn't have the force of law, but also they just keep using it as an example of like a spot where universities are laying down and literally no one's asking them to do that. And we've seen this in North Carolina for sure, but Pittsburgh, Texas, Cleveland, I mean, all around the country, Chicago. And that one has really stood out to me because I feel like we're continuing to see examples of universities do this and continuing to hear, the major group that's representing their interests be like, please stop, please stop.
I think that they're running into this conflict between what their industry is, the industry association is saying, and what their general counsel or lawyer on call is telling them. The lawyer's like, well, you might as well just do it because, like, what's the big deal? I mean, but, the big deal is that, well, colleges could be, at least their campus communities are perceiving that they are capitulating to the federal government's sort of vision for higher education when, again, they don't necessarily have to do it, but they're really stuck between sort of their campus communities and what the general counsel is telling them, like, yeah, you should probably just erase diversity from every webpage.
Yeah, I think that's so true. And I did an interview with Todd Wolfson, who's the president of the American Association of University Professors a month or two ago. And something he said with me has just like keeps ringing in my ear, which is that I asked, what do faculty expect from their presidents and their administrations right now? And he said, nothing. They do not expect anything. They do not expect that their president will stand up for them. And I think the website example, maybe it feels small, but it's just kind of another mark to that point.
Yeah, and just really briefly to Sarah's point, like that tension between what's coming from, national associations and like these highly respected groups versus on the campus level, I think the websites is another one of those like squishy examples. Like, is this really about the federal level or is this state level pressure? And distinguishing between those two things is challenging in this moment, like pinpointing exactly where the pressure is coming from and where colleges are really feeling those points.
To switch to an area where we have seen universities be a little more public about the pressure that they're feeling. Matt, you've done a bunch of reporting about the changes to research funding and how that would affect colleges and universities in North Carolina. Can you talk a little bit about what's happening, where that all stands, and where we think that's going?
Yeah, I think in some ways it's very similar. And I think Sarah, Erin, and Colleen have all used the word uncertainty already, and I think that's the one-word answer to this as well. Is just it's very unclear where it stands. So if you take a step back and sort of try to quantify the impact that it would have on North Carolina, the state as a whole has a lot to lose. So for both this current fiscal year, as far as we got until the money stopped coming out because of some of the Trump administration's actions. And if you look last year, the last fiscal year, North Carolina was about sixth in the country in terms of state and how much money they brought in. NIH and NSF money combined last fiscal year was about $2.2 billion across the state. So that's the sort of dollar figure that's at stake. Someone mentioned that it's really heavily weighted towards the triangle, which is absolutely true sort of overall. So Duke got about $580 million of that. UNC Chapel Hill got 530. RTI, which is a scientific research institute in the triangle, got 400 million. But it's also spread across the state elsewhere. So the Wake Forest Health System got 140 million. There's a clinical research organization in Wilmington called PPP Development that got 57 million. right? So the big dollar figures are absolutely sort of located in the triangle, but there are impacts across the state to the universities, first and foremost, but also the health systems connected to them and their research partners that are sort of operating alongside of them. I also think that the workforce numbers are really interesting here. So there are about 5.5 million people in the labor market in North Carolina. 1.2 million of them, so 20% or so, work in education, healthcare, or social assistance, right? So those are industries that are absolutely tied up in federal funding, both as research funding, which is the primary focus right now, but also we're talking about Medicaid and other sorts of federal funding that are also facing their own challenges right now. I think we'll get into this more, I'm sure, but the reason I think people are sort of hesitant trying to sort of preemptively comply is because those are very big numbers and like a very base level. The fact that it's all held up in court, right? Because the various judge orders have ruled that this money has to start flowing, or that the way the Trump administration stopped it can't stand. I think people are just sort of really unsure what to do. In large part because the money hasn't started flowing in a lot of places yet, right? Like even though the administration's been told they have to release it, the various bodies that decide who gets money and what gets approved just aren't meeting, and so they can't, right? Like it just sort of stopped. The last I heard from a researcher at Duke is the only money they've seen sort of coming through are renewals of grants that had already been previously approved. So I talked to somebody at Wake Forest who was saying like, he runs a small lab, relatively small lab, but got millions of dollars in NIH funding, and was saying like, our studies take months. Like, do we start it now? Like, are we going to run out of money before we get to the end of it? He was sort of, we're now at the point of the year where people are sort of sending PhD offers and trying to decide on funding. And like, because it's all uncertain now, are you going to commit to 5 years for a PhD student? Or like, how do you structure that offer? So I think you're seeing a lot of those questions. That Wake Forest researcher had already run into hiring issues, right? Where he had a postdoc position open, he was ready, he found a candidate, wanted to hire somebody, and then all these orders came out and he didn't, right? Like, so I think you have a lot of those sort of short-term decisions that are happening right now. But one of these examples that I think shows the sort of problem here that stuck in my head is at UNC Chapel Hill. A few months ago, they approved about $230 million in debt to build a new translational research building. And the phrase, this is one of my like favorite finance neologisms. They call it self-liquidating debt on the assumption that like the building will pay itself off, because in adding all of this new stuff, they'll be able to bring in more grant money. But the money that will pay off that building are the indirect costs the Trump administration is trying to slash, right? So this is like a hundreds of $1 million decision now for a decades-long project, right, to actually sort of pay it off in the long run, that is now being thrown into question. And so I think at the administrative level, that's sort of what people are wrestling with. And I think that's really difficult, which is why you're getting to the point now where you're seeing hiring freezes and budget cuts. So NC State and Duke have already sort of announced some. UNC Chapel Hill is doing some restructuring. I talked to somebody at the North Carolina independent colleges and universities who was saying like they just spend a lot of time asking each other, people on campus, national organizations, lobbyists, lawyers, like what is happening? Where is it standing? What are other people doing? And I think that sort of level of work is really interrupting lots of other things. We spent a lot of time, I think, sort of focusing on some of the bigger schools, like the R1 universities, because those dollar figures are so much higher. But I think it's also worth stressing here that the smaller schools, even though they don't get as much funding, from some of these places, they have much tighter margins. And so, losing a $20 million grant sounds like a lot less, but is, really causes a drastic impact and can be an existential question. So trying to navigate all of those uncertainties is, I think, where we are right now.
Oh, we got a question in the chat that's related to this that I'll open up to anybody who feels comfortable answering this. This person asks, for existing NIH awards, so not new ones, are we able to draw down the allocated funds, or is the cash frozen?
I'll start with this, and then I want to kick it to Colleen, who can also weigh in. Great question. I think when I was mentioning earlier, like that there are specific institutions like your Columbia or, for example, Penn, University of Maine, who've had large amounts of their grants either canceled or frozen for a period of time because they're under investigation. They're getting a lot of attention for that, right? But in fact, we're seeing all over the country that a lot of NIH and NSF payments are just not going out and in any regular way. It's kind of hard to understand the exact like prevalence of that, but there's no question that a large share of NIH money and NSF grants, National Science Foundation grants, are just not like the payments are not being made, even for existing awards. And then there's a whole other issue too, where the process for awarding new grants has been slowed down dramatically because the Trump administration has both slashed the staff of the NIH and dramatically either first for a while paused the sort of study sections that are required to approve grants, and now it's taking a really long time to get it back going up. So like for existing NIH awards, are you able to draw on existing funds? Yes, you are legally able to do that. I mean, that is, you have been given that funding. However, the reporting that we've done and that a lot of other folks have done suggests that a lot of that funding is not going out. And frankly, like higher ed is going to have to rely on the courts for that. And whether the Trump administration is going to comply with court orders is an open question. Colleen, anything to add on that?
I guess I would just say that I think the fact that you're asking this question, Alexandra, sort of underscores like a lot of what we've been talking about, which is that it's very confusing. It's very, very stressful for researchers. It's existential. We've seen different examples of, provosts or heads of research kind of tell their faculty, like, not to worry, keep doing what you're doing. We're figuring it out as we go. But I just think your question sort of gets at like that core anxiety. If as what Sarah is saying is happening, like you aren't getting the money you're supposed to be getting, that raises a lot of questions that don't really have clear answers right now.
Yeah, and just to sort of add to that, an example of this uncertainty around research funding, we did some reporting about a month ago now that found that a specific kind of award that was being given out by the NIH that was sort of earmarked specifically for diversity applicants, so folks who are underrepresented in the sciences, that basically they were applying through this grant through this diversity lane because they had been told to. There was a period where those grants were or their applications were just thrown out. So the federal government was essentially throwing out applications from researchers from underrepresented backgrounds for this really major, important NIH grant. We reported on it. The Trump administration then restored those applications. And so we thought, okay, everything is good. Now we found out again, those applications from diverse researchers are being pulled down again. And so it's whiplash. It's like, I don't know what to make of it every given day. And the challenge with science, right, is you can't, like Matt was saying, you can't just turn it on and off. Like you can't just turn an experiment on and off. Like, okay, well, if we get the payment next week, it's fine. I mean, some of these studies have been going on for, 20 years in some cases. And that predictability of federal money is really essential.
I think just to highlight that uncertainty again, I think one of the things we've heard from people on campus in administrative roles is they're trying really hard to sort of reduce misinformation or disinformation or sort rumors from different things that are true sort of for one type of grant but not for another, or in one field and not for another. And I think that level of sort of uncertainty and kind of chaos is just taking up a lot of space and time and mental energy.
We got another question in the chat that I think is also about this research funding, but if you were asking about a different policy, type up in the chat and let me know. This person said, do you have any thoughts about the impacts on HBCUs and TCUs in North Carolina? Sounds like that. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I can start to try to answer. I think this is one of the a big thing we've talked about sort of internally within the assembly team is what this means. I think some of the if you look at North Carolina A&T, for instance, right? Like they do a lot of agricultural research and they do a lot of things in that field. so, the specific kinds of funding streams they're getting, I think, cause some issues, but the DEI aspect of like how that applies to HBCUs, I think is a real open question. And I think a lot of what we've heard is a lot of people at HBCUs sort of feel targeted, and that I think students and faculty. And so I don't know that there's any real clarity around exactly how some of these anti-DEI orders will be interpreted as they apply to HBCUs. I do also know that some of those federal funding, specific funding streams for HBCUs and tribal colleges have been sort of threatened. Sarah, I think y'all have done a bunch of really great coverage on this. Do you want to?
Yeah, I can add a little bit to this. So, it's a great question. I think, right, there is a lot of uncertainty right now. When Trump took office, one of the first things he did was basically eliminate these like White House initiatives for tribal colleges as well as Hispanic serving institutions, basically just got rid of a lot of the sort of initiatives, the committees that had been devoted to kind of how can we continue to support these really important institutions. The one type of minority serving institution he did not touch was historically Black colleges. So there's kind of a long arc of history here with Trump and HBCUs. He actually, like, President Trump sees himself as like, I am a president who supports HBCUs. So I actually don't expect to see major cuts to like HBCU specific funding in the coming months and years under Trump, because that is something that he has explicitly made a priority. And again, in this world where he wrote an executive order getting rid of initiatives for tribal colleges, for Hispanic serving institutions, he left the HBCUs alone. So that's something to keep in mind. Another thing I do want to mention, though, is that this isn't necessarily something we've seen yet from the Trump administration, but there are a number of kind of conservative thinkers, think tanks, people in Trump's orbit who want to effectively get rid of the minority serving institution designation altogether, because it does, like, from their standpoint, this is treating people differently based on race, which they consider to be a violation of educational civil rights law. And so we have not seen anything on that front, but there is a subset of like conservative thinkers and folks potentially in Congress who are interested in looking at how minority serving institutions are funded. So stay tuned for more on that. I'll drop a link in the chat to a piece that we just did on this subject. So a lot of uncertainty, but that's kind of my read of the situation right now.
I want to jump in real quick and say that we are going to have a poll for everyone. So it should pop up on your screen. We'd like you to tell us what changes you have seen on your campuses in 2025. So take a minute to answer that and we will keep going. Also, thank you to everybody who's put questions in the Q&A. I know I keep saying the chat, I mean the Q&A, I apologize. And keep them coming because these are great questions. We want to talk a little bit about where things are going, which is what some of the questions have also asked. Sarah, can you talk a little bit about the Trump administration's plans for the education department, what the potential unwinding of the education department, if they're successful with that, what that would mean, and also what that would mean for student loans?
Yes, I'll give it a shot. I will clarify that I'm not, again, I'm more of a generalist, not a huge financial aid expert, but I'm going to do my best to give you the clearest possible picture of the situation. So basically at this stage, right, the Trump administration has been very clear that it wants to dismantle the education department. It cannot get rid of the education department without congressional approval, but they can get rid of a lot of staff, which effectively through buyouts and through layoffs and through potentially some other measures, they're going to continue chipping away at the staff. At this point, the education department is about half the size it was when President Trump took office, if you incorporate all the layoffs that he's put underway. So there are kind of three major areas that are impacted by these, what this means for your campus, sort of the education department at the federal level. Number one is education research. We are seeing dramatic cuts to the researchers who kind of compile information and data on student outcomes, on, kind of spotting achievement gaps, potentially for, students from certain backgrounds are not graduating at the same rate as other students, test scores, things that are designed to give us an aggregate picture of how are the nation's students faring, both at the K-12 level as well as at the higher ed level. Those departments have been totally decimated. We at the Chronicle are going to have a story about that coming up just today. So I actually think it just published, so I'll drop that in the chat too. Civil rights enforcement is another area that's important. So the education department has gotten rid of a lot of the people who handle investigations of potential civil rights violations. So we're talking about, racial discrimination, sex discrimination, very importantly, students with disabilities. This is their route for complaining that their school or college is not accommodating their disability, and that office has just been totally decimated. So now we'll get to financial aid. So at this point, the education secretary, who just recently took office, Linda McMahon, has said repeatedly that there are no plans to cut funding, education funding for individual students. So what that means from what I can interpret is that there are no plans to get rid of of financial aid, of Pell Grants, for example. The challenge is it's sort of hard, I think, for a lot of people in higher ed to square, like, how are we going to continue this apparatus of administering student grant aid and student loans with a financial aid department that has been, the staff is like just a share of the size that it once was. And so I think there's a lot of uncertainty there. There's, what happens if the FAFSA, the form that everyone has to submit for financial aid every year, what if it stops working and there's not enough people in the education department to like fix it? That's already been an issue. There are already reports of issues where the big database of college related sort of information, the IPEDS database, has been gone down at various points in time, and there are just not enough staff to keep that thing going. And so another thing I'm going to mention here that's potentially on some people's minds on financial aid, the Pell Grant. This is the really important grant program for low-income students. And their Pell Grants are running a deficit as of the fiscal year 2025. So that means there's not technically enough money in the federal budget to cover all of the Pell Grants that are going out the door. So my understanding is that this is not like currently an issue, at least in the budget that the sort of stuff that passed like a week ago to avert a government shutdown, or 10 days ago. However, the Congress does need to act by like September in order to avert this shortfall. And you might be thinking, well, we have, a government that is not looking at adding a lot of funding for things. So are they going to fix this? My impression is that the Pell Grant program has massive bipartisan support. Education Secretary McMahon has been very adamant that she supports Pell Grants. In fact, she supports expanding Pell Grants for workforce development programs. And so I don't know what to expect on this front, but if one program is probably going to be okay in the Trump administration era, it's the Pell Grants. It has bipartisan support. It's not popular to cut it. That's kind of my read on the situation of ed department impact on individual campuses.
Sarah, we got a question in the chat that's related to this about Department of Education recently releasing new regulations on financial aid, limiting aid to degree-seeking programs and capping aid to 120 credit hours. How is this decision made, and what more regulations on financial aid would you anticipate?
Yep. So again, not a huge financial aid expert, so I'm going to try to keep this pretty high level. My understanding is that this question relates to, this is about regulations that took effect in July of 2024, specifically for career training programs. So this is not for every single program that a college offers, but it is for career training programs. This is related to something folks may have heard of called the gainful employment regulations, which is basically an attempt to sort of put a structure in place for holding these career training programs accountable for getting students jobs and in a position to like pay off student debt, et cetera. I'm going to be honest, the Trump administration, first of all, they're not big on regulations, especially that could affect for-profit colleges. A lot of these career training programs are run by for-profit colleges. And so I do not know what the plan is on these regulations exactly or how that decision was made, but just didn't want to say in general, Trump administration is not going to do a ton of regulating. I don't expect that really impacts career training programs. That's not something that Republican administrations have done in the past. And I just generally don't expect a ton of additional regulations specifically on financial aid because, again, a lot of these things that took effect in July of 2024, that was Biden administration regulations. Trump administration doesn't necessarily support those. Even if they haven't been undone, they may not enforce them. So that's kind of my high level read on that situation.
I'll add there, this is not a regulation from the Department of Ed, but I think in a normal year, the thing that I think would be taking up everyone's attention would be the giant bill floating around out there called the College Cost Reduction Act. And I do think there are some major changes there. About I think the one that I'm particularly interested in watching is the elimination of the plus loan programs, particularly the Graduate Plus program, which is how a ton of the master's and PhD programs that are real revenue drivers for universities are paid for by students. And so I think that would be a major change. There's also some stuff in there that I don't understand yet that I would like to dig into about changing the financial accounting methods used for student loans that I think would sort of have a big impact on how they show up on the books. So I think those things will be important to watch as that legislation sort of makes its way through Congress.
Switching gears a little bit, Erin, we've talked a lot recently about how North Carolina schools are updating graduation requirements, reevaluating curriculum. And I wondered if you could just talk about what state lawmakers, policymakers, academics, the public, et cetera, what they think college students should learn in college. What are the things that you should graduate from college or university having done?
Yeah, I think that's one of the big questions that, I talked briefly about, the February 5th memo that's changing, general education requirements, major specific requirements. That second part, what major specific requirements are, that's something I think there's a big question still around in North Carolina. Schools can still ask for waivers. We haven't seen those come forward yet to teach these classes. So I think there's a lot of things in the air right now about how the UNC system is responding to this, but it also does get at bigger questions, as you alluded to, Emily, about, what is college for and what should colleges, what should colleges teach students? What should they come away learning? And, I'll drop a link in the chat after this if we don't, but I think this is really exemplified well in a recent episode actually of College Matters, which is the Chronicle of Higher Ed's podcast, which digs into some reporting on a Florida law that banned general ed requirements that, quote, distort significant historical events or include a curriculum that it teaches identity politics or are, quote, based on theories that systemic racism, sexism, oppression, and privilege are inherent to institutions of the United States, quote. It also says, classes should focus on Western civilization, the nation's historical documents. And, one of the justifications that's cited there is that, the chancellor of the system told the Chronicle that this is part of getting people to believe in higher ed again, believe, this public perception of higher ed, that it's a part of this and addressing people's concerns about what are students learning. And, I think that gen ed for a while, I think it's described, this way in the College Matters podcast is sort of a third rail of higher ed in general. Like, how do we teach students to come away with the skills that they need to succeed in the workforce? I think that's a piece of it. It's also this question of like historical foundations of Western civilization and like the US versus like newer intellectual traditions that are more inclusive and encompassing of diverse perspectives. So I think there's a lot of questions in general out there floating around about general ed that again sort of get at this question of what is higher ed for? What are we meant to really teach students and have them come away from this experience? So I think that's something that's going to underlie the debate as well in North Carolina as we move forward and thinking about general ed and majors.
Kind of related to that, we got a question in the chat that I want to direct at Matt about what steps you think colleges and universities can take to make a stronger case for the fundamentals of research investment, academic freedom, et cetera. I know you're interested in at what point we start to see universities speak more publicly and make more of an argument about where policy things are going. Can you tackle that?
Sure. I think it's sort of it is a good follow on to what Erin was just saying, because I think in some ways the problem is that there's not a lot of agreement on what colleges should do or what this should look like, and so making that case publicly is hard. When I worked at I worked at Duke for a long time, and an unnamed department there was telling me that they're having trouble writing like a single paragraph describing what their department does because they couldn't agree among themselves. And I think, this is a thing we all love to make fun of about higher ed. And when you get into a crisis situation like that, it's also a major barrier. Um, so let's see. I guess this is going to be sort of a long answer to touch on some other stuff, but I think if you look sort of broadly at how these issues are talked about, we've, for very obvious reasons, analyzed them in terms of like what the Trump administration is doing, what universities are doing in response. But I don't think either of those groups is particularly unified. Like the Trump administration is not one unified group, and universities certainly aren't. And so I think one of the major factors that I'm trying to follow along with and pay attention to, because I think it'll shape how this all plays out, is the fights within those two groups. So if you look on the universities, I've been really kind of shocked and impressed, honestly, about how well universities have kept people sort of unified so far and sort of speaking in one voice. This is the phrase that the vice chancellor for research in Chapel Hill keeps using. But often that's sort of been these backroom channels, right? Like, so I think what universities are often doing that is not visible is making the case for higher ed in private meetings, right? They're lobbying with legislators, they're in courtrooms, they're sort of working through industry associations, all that sort of stuff. And I think that's been sort of that's the strategy. And the real challenge is going to be sort of maintaining a sort of collective spirit on campus now, right? Once you start seeing hiring freezes and budget cuts that are going to really impact different parts of the university differently. And I think once those concrete issues start to hit, the existing fault lines within universities are going to change, right? So I think you've seen it in the examples that we've all used a little bit, right? So if you're going to convince Republicans who are deeply skeptical of higher ed about the value, then I think a lot of what you're going to focus on is medicine, right? Like which is a real employment and economy driver in lots of these places. You're going to talk about applied research. But those are the places that get most of the funding and attention on campuses already. And so you're leaving the humanities out, you're going to leave the basic sciences out. And so I think how people respond to those is going to be big. And I think you can see this in the way Columbia's responded already, Columbia University. One of the things they had to do to sort of try to secure their funding, to secure the right to negotiate for their funding, is put their area studies departments in academic receivership. And so there's a tension, I think, for folks to be able to sort of sacrifice some parts of the university to preserve the major revenue bodies elsewhere. And I think that's going to get really hard, but that's also sort of the most obvious way to sort of make the case, right? Like if you want to make a donation that is not politically weighty, like doing it to cancer research is like the most obvious place to go. And so I think universities, have an incentive to do the same kind of thing. And I think that's, I think that's going to be the sort of trouble, right? Like the short-term logic of doing that sort of creates a sort of longer-term problem on campuses. The other thing I'll add really quickly is that I think the Trump coalition is also very divided in lots of ways. And so, if you look at like the libertarian right and the religious right and the tech right, those are all sort of very different groups, and you've already seen this sort of federally with the fight about H-1B visas that sort of blew up on the right between Elon Musk and Donald Trump and some of the more hardline immigration folks within the Trump coalition. And so I think how you make the case about higher ed to those different groups is very different, and whether they'll stay unified is also a question mark for me. And then we haven't really talked about community colleges much, but a lot of these community colleges really depend on this funding. And, there are some places that are trying to build a aerospace engineering sort of industries down east through community colleges and through some of this research funding and DoD funding and elsewhere. And so I think you have folks there that I think they're responding to different arguments than other parts of the state.
The first part of that question in the Q&A was about why higher education became such a target for this administration. And Colleen, I want to throw that one to you before we wrap things up.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think at a very basic level, one reason that higher ed has become a target is because in 2020, when George Floyd was murdered, we saw colleges around the country take very clear political stances against that. And then we come now up into the present day, and when protests broke out on college campuses across the country last year over Israel's war in Gaza, colleges kind of got stuck. They couldn't come up with a statement that pleased everybody. All of a sudden, they didn't want to be political actors anymore. They wanted to be apolitical. The protests that we saw, Columbia got a lot of attention and still is, but they were happening all over the country at differing levels. It was not just like an elite institution thing, which is how sometimes people talked about it. But anyway, there's this tension that still exists, I think, of are colleges political actors or not? And they've changed their tune on that, which has opened them up to a lot of criticism. And then more broadly, kind of to zoom out, I would say that I think what's really important to remember here is that what's at stake is not just about colleges and people who work at them. What's at stake is also about communities. And I don't think that colleges always do a very good job of making an affirmative case for what they mean to their community and their state and their region. Community colleges do a great job at that, and 4 years could really learn something if they paid attention. I think that's part of why what's happening right now is so existential, because it does really matter to communities. When universities are threatened, that affects everybody. Colleges drive economies. They are major workforce trainers for local businesses. They, provide childcare to student parents who are going to get degrees and new skills. They offer clinical trials for Alzheimer's and cancer patients. Like, the list really goes on and on. And I think that, that's what's at stake here. That's what's so significant here. And that's what we're holding close to in our coverage. That's why I think, authoritative accountability, local coverage of higher ed that the Assembly and others do really matters in this moment, because you can tease out those stakes. And then, there are still some significant questions about what happens to all the work that has been done to track equity gaps, like Sarah mentioned, and to increase access to these institutions, which are often seen as being elitist. Even though, again, just to make clear, most colleges accept everyone who applies to them, and most people go to college in their hometown. So it's not this elitist, rich kid enterprise that sometimes it gets talked about as. Certainly, there are wealthy institutions that are not reflective of the diversity of this country, but that's by and large not what most institutions are like, to be clear. And there's been a lot of efforts also to expand the pipeline into jobs and into STEM and into different industries that have been historically white and male. And so I think there are really major questions about what happens to all of that work now, not just because we can't talk about it in DEI terms anymore, because, to be clear, that work is still going to continue. Community colleges are still going to work to train people for better, more high-paying jobs, and they're just not doing it with the words that, Christopher Rufo and Trump are using to describe it. But yeah, I think when we think about why higher ed is a target, it's because it's seen as elitist. It's seen as, indoctrinating young people with liberal woke agendas, and it's not talked about in real terms. And I don't think people always realize how deeply entwined colleges and universities are in their lives and in their jobs and in the cities where they live.
All right. Well, with that, we're right about an hour. So we're going to wrap things up. If you have questions that we didn't get to answer today, we would like to tackle those in a future event or in the quad newsletter. Please email those to highered@theassemblync.com. I promise we check that email box. And thank you so much for joining us today. Please check out our March subscription sale. Subscribe to the quad if you haven't already. Let us know if you'd like to subscribe to our new politics newsletter. We have a lot going on at the Assembly. Thank you, everybody, for participating.